Maybe the problem isn't that she embarrassed the company, Sebastian Hale said quietly, his cold gray eyes sweeping across the silent ballroom rehearsal. Maybe the problem is that she walked into a room full of wealthy people and still had more grace than all of you. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but 3 hours earlier, nobody in that room would have believed he'd ever defend Claire Bennett at all. The Royal Winter Gala rehearsal inside the Astoria Crown Hotel glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors that reflected the gold light like still water. Every detail screamed old money. Diamond bracelets flashed beneath designer sleeves. Champagne glasses chimed softly against silver trays. Even the air smelled expensive, layered with perfume, roses, and imported cedar polish. Claire Bennett stood near the back of the ballroom, gripping a digital tablet against her chest, trying not to breathe too loudly. She hated events like this. Hated the invisible rulebook nobody ever explained but somehow expected her to understand. At 26, Claire had spent the last 4 years working behind the scenes for Hale and Rowe events, usually hidden near service elevators or supply closets where wealthy people didn't have to notice her existence. Tonight was different. Tonight, one mistake could cost the company a multi-million-dollar royal partnership. Table 7 needs the crystal menu holders switched before 6. A sharp voice snapped through her earpiece. Claire nodded quickly and crossed the ballroom in black flats whose soles were beginning to peel apart. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the centerpieces. Around her, executives and stylists floated through the room in tailored suits and sleek gowns, barely sparing her a glance. Claire was used to that too. Invisible was safer. Invisible paid rent. Invisible helped keep the lights on in the tiny apartment she shared with her sick mother across town. But Invisible became impossible the second she turned around and collided with Lady Vivienne Laurent. The champagne glass tipped instantly. Pale gold liquid splashed across Vivienne's silver couture gown. The room froze. Claire's stomach dropped so hard it physically hurt. Vivienne stared down at the stain in horror. "Do you have any idea what this dress costs?" she hissed. Claire's face burned. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see." "Of course you didn't," Vivienne interrupted sharply. "People like you never do." A few nearby guests laughed under their breath. Claire bent instinctively, reaching for napkins, but Vivienne stepped back like Claire's touch itself would ruin her further. "This gown came from Paris," Vivienne said loudly enough for half the ballroom to hear. "Some people simply don't belong in rooms like this." Claire swallowed hard. She should apologize again. She should keep her head down. She should survive this the way she survived everything else. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. Calm, deep, dangerous. Enough. Sebastian Hale stood near the grand staircase overlooking the ballroom. 6'2", black tuxedo perfectly fitted, expression unreadable. The billionaire CEO of Hale and Rowe rarely attended rehearsals personally, which somehow made his presence even more intimidating. Conversations died the moment he descended the stairs. Claire had only spoken to him directly twice in 4 years. Both times lasted less than 30 seconds. Sebastian approached slowly, eyes settling on a champagne stain before lifting toward Claire. She expected anger, expected termination. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "Curious. You work logistics?" he asked. Claire nodded carefully. "Yes, sir." Vivienne folded her arms. She ruined a $40,000 gown. Sebastian remained silent for a moment too long. Then his gaze shifted back to Claire's worn black flats, the loose thread hanging from her sleeve, the way she held herself like she was apologizing simply for existing. Something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. "Tell me," he said quietly, "do you understand why this gala matters?" Claire hesitated. "It's the largest royal fundraising event in New York this year." A few executives looked surprised she even knew that. Sebastian noticed too. "And what exactly qualifies you to speak on royal events?" Vivienne asked mockingly. Claire lowered her eyes. "Nothing." Vivienne smirked. "Exactly." But Sebastian kept watching Claire with unsettling intensity. Then, without warning, the corner of his mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile. More dangerous than that. Then perhaps, he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom, Miss Bennet should attend the royal gala herself. Silence crashed over the room. Claire blinked. Vivian actually laughed. Attend, she repeated. Sebastian never looked away from Claire. If she believes she belongs here, he continued smoothly, she'll prove it tomorrow night in front of 500 royals, diplomats, and billionaires. The room erupted into quiet amusement. Someone whispered, this should be entertaining. Claire felt heat crawl up her neck. Humiliation wrapped around her ribs so tightly she could barely inhale. Sebastian reached into his tuxedo pocket, pulled out a black embossed invitation, and handed it directly to her. Their fingers brushed briefly. Warm, steady, intentional. Royal Gala admission, he said softly. Don't disappoint us, Miss Bennet. Claire did not remember leaving the ballroom. 1 second the executives were laughing softly behind champagne glasses, and the next she was standing alone on a crowded Manhattan sidewalk with cold wind pushing against her face and a black royal invitation trembling in her hand. Yellow taxi lights streaked past through the evening traffic while Christmas decorations glowed above Fifth Avenue in soft gold and silver. Around her, New York moved the same way it always did. Fussed, loud, unforgiving. But inside Claire's chest, everything felt strangely still. She stared down at the embossed invitation again. Royal Winter Gala. Tomorrow evening. Formal white tie attire required. Hosted in honor of Prince Alexander of Wessex. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the dark glass of a storefront window nearby. Loose blonde hair falling from a rushed ponytail. Tired blue eyes. Black work blazer with a missing button near the cuff. She looked exactly like what Vivian Laurent had called her. Someone who did not belong. Claire let out a shaky breath and started walking toward the subway station, wrapping her thin coat tighter around herself. Against the November cold, the train ride downtown took almost 40 minutes. Across from her, 2 college girls laughed while scrolling through photos of luxury dresses on a phone screen. A businessman slept with his forehead against the subway window. Somewhere farther down the car, someone played a soft jazz melody on a saxophone. Claire sat quietly gripping the invitation inside her bag like it might disappear if she loosened her fingers for even a second. She still could not understand why Sebastian Hale had done it. Humiliation? Entertainment? Some cruel billionaire experiment? Men like Sebastian did not notice women like her unless something had gone wrong. And tonight, everything had. By the time she climbed the cracked stairs to her apartment building in Queens, her feet ached badly enough to make her limp. The hallway smelled faintly like old radiator heat and laundry detergent. Apartment 4C sat at the very end beside a flickering overhead light that buzzed constantly. Claire unlocked the door quietly and stepped inside. The apartment was barely 600 square feet, but it was warm. Warm mattered. Claire! A weak voice called softly from the couch. Claire immediately forced a smile onto her face. Hey, Mom, you should be sleeping. Her mother sat beneath a faded blanket with an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose. The television played quietly in the background, some holiday baking show neither of them were actually watching. You were late, her mother said gently. Big event. Claire slipped off her shoes near the door, carefully hiding the peeling sole beneath the couch before her mother could notice. Something like that. She moved into the tiny kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk, leftover soup, a pharmacy bag filled with medication bottles. Reality returned quickly there. Rent due next week. Hospital balance overdue. Another cardiology appointment scheduled Friday morning. Claire closed her eyes briefly before grabbing 2 bowls. You ate? Her mother asked. Claire nodded automatically even though she had not. At work. The lie came easily now. Too easily. A few minutes later, she sat beside her mother on the couch. While steam rose softly from microwave soup, her mother noticed the black invitation almost instantly. What is that? Claire hesitated. Nothing important. Claire. She sighed quietly and handed it over. Her mother adjusted her reading glasses and stared at the invitation in disbelief. The Royal Gala? Claire laughed once under her breath. Bitter. Embarrassed. Apparently, I am tonight's charity case. But her mother kept studying the invitation carefully. You are going? Absolutely not. Claire stood immediately, carrying both bowls toward the sink. Mom, people like Sebastian Hale do not invite people I meet anywhere unless they expect a disaster. And what if he does? Her mother asked softly behind her. Claire stopped moving. Then he will get one. Silence settled briefly between them, except for the sound of pipes rattling somewhere inside the old building. Finally, her mother spoke again. Your grandmother used to say wealthy people can buy beauty, but they cannot buy presents. Claire looked down at the sink. Grandma also cleaned mansions for rich people, and she came home every night knowing exactly how they behaved. Her mother smiled faintly. That is why she taught you. Claire swallowed hard. She had not touched those lessons in years. Not since dropping out of the Manhattan Academy of Arts after her father died. Not since medical bills replaced tuition payments. Not since survival became more important than dreams. Slowly, she crossed the apartment toward the narrow bookshelf near the window and pulled open the bottom drawer. Beneath old sweaters and unpaid utility bills sat a worn navy blue notebook wrapped carefully in cloth. Her grandmother's etiquette journal. Claire ran her fingers across the faded gold lettering on the cover. Royal customs, historical art references, ballroom etiquette, conversation structure. Tiny handwritten notes filled every page in elegant cursive. She opened the notebook carefully, and an old sapphire hairpin slipped into her palm. The deep blue stone caught the apartment light instantly. Her grandmother's favorite piece. Claire stared at it silently, while memories returned all at once. Long afternoons, practicing posture beside tiny kitchen tables, learning how to identify classical paintings from library books, repeating royal introductions until midnight while her grandmother corrected every syllable. Grace, her grandmother always said, is how you treat people when nobody important is watching. Claire closed the notebook slowly. Across the room, her mother smiled softly. You already belong in those rooms, sweetheart. Claire looked back down at the black invitation in her hand. For the first time that night, she stopped feeling ashamed. And somewhere across Manhattan, inside a glass penthouse overlooking Central Park, Sebastian Hale stood alone beside his office window, staring at security footage paused on a single frame. Claire Bennett kneeling beside a frightened waitress moments after the champagne accident, quietly helping the girl breathe while everyone else laughed. Sebastian replayed the footage again in silence. Then once more. Claire barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the ballroom again. Crystal chandeliers, smirking faces. Sebastian Hale watching her like he was trying to solve a puzzle nobody else could see. By 6:30 the next morning, pale winter sunlight crept through the apartment blinds while radiator pipes hissed softly against the walls. Claire sat cross-legged on the living room floor wearing old gray sweatpants with her grandmother's etiquette journal open beside her and a cup of cold coffee forgotten near her knee. The sapphire hairpin rested carefully on top of the notebook like a tiny piece of another life. Royal introductions, she whispered quietly to herself while reading handwritten notes from 20 years ago. Never offer your hand first unless prompted. Eye contact, calm posture. Shoulders relaxed. She stood slowly and practiced a formal greeting toward the reflection in the dark television screen. The movement felt awkward at first. Stiff. Embarrassing. But after a few attempts, muscle memory began returning in fragments she thought she had lost forever. Her grandmother's voice still lived somewhere inside her head. Soft. Patient. Exact. Elegance is never loud, Claire. The loudest people in the room are usually the least important. Claire let out a quiet breath and tried again. Across the couch, her mother watched silently beneath a blanket, pretending not to notice. You are standing straighter already, she finally said with a faint smile. Claire rolled her eyes lightly. I look ridiculous. No, her mother replied. You look like yourself again. The words hit harder than Claire expected. She turned away quickly before emotion could reach her face. By noon, snow had started falling lightly outside. Tiny white flakes drifted across Queens while Claire rode the subway toward Manhattan carrying a garment bag that held the only formal dress she owned. Dark navy. Thrift store. $32 3 years ago. The hem needed repair, and one sleeve sat unevenly on the shoulder, but it was all she had. She planned to quietly alter it herself during lunch break before anyone could see. The Hale and Rowe headquarters occupied 40 floors of glass and steel overlooking Bryant Park. Inside, employees moved quickly through marble hallways balancing coffee cups and designer portfolios while giant digital screens displayed luxury campaign footage from Paris and Milan. Claire kept her head down the entire walk to the employee changing rooms downstairs. She almost made it unnoticed, too. Almost. Well, look who decided to show up. Claire froze near the hallway mirror as Vivian Laurent appeared behind her in a cream-colored wool coat, worth more than Claire's yearly rent. Two assistants followed close behind, carrying garment bags and jewelry cases. Vivian's eyes dropped instantly toward the navy dress hanging from Claire's arm. Amusement flickered across her face. "That is your gala dress?" Claire tightened her grip slightly. "It is fine for one night." Vivian laughed softly. "Oh, sweetheart, this event is actual royalty attending, not community theater judges." The assistants snickered quietly. Claire felt heat crawl into her cheeks again, but before she could respond, another voice entered calmly from farther down the hallway. "Is there a problem?" Sebastian Hale stepped out of the elevator wearing a charcoal overcoat over a fitted black suit, one hand tucked loosely into his pocket. The entire corridor shifted instantly. Assistants straightened. Conversations died. Vivian's smile sharpened immediately. "No problem," she said smoothly. "We were just discussing fashion standards." Sebastian's gaze moved briefly toward Claire, toward the garment bag, toward the frayed seam near the zipper she had tried unsuccessfully to hide. His expression remained unreadable. "Miss Bennet," he said evenly, "my office." 10 minutes. Claire blinked once in surprise. "Sir, 10 minutes." Then he walked away without another word. Vivian folded her arms with visible satisfaction. "Well," she murmured quietly, "that cannot be good." Claire's stomach twisted the entire elevator ride upstairs. Sebastian Hale's office occupied the top floor corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, covered in falling snow. The room itself looked almost painfully expensive. Black marble fireplace, modern art, shelves lined with fashion awards and international business trophies. Claire suddenly became hyper-aware of her worn coat and melting snow on her shoes. Sebastian stood near the window, reading something on a tablet when she entered. "Close the door," he said calmly. Claire obeyed immediately. Silence stretched several uncomfortable seconds before he finally looked up. "You intended to attend tonight wearing that dress?" Claire lifted her chin slightly despite herself. "It is the only formal dress I own." Sebastian studied her for a long moment. Not mocking, not pitying, assessing. "And yet you still plan to come." Claire hesitated. "You invited me." The faintest reaction crossed his face. Almost approval. He set the tablet aside and walked toward her slowly. "Most people in this city spend their entire lives trying to impress rooms like tonight's gala," he said quietly. "You seem more interested in surviving it." Claire let out a nervous laugh before she could stop herself. "Survival has been more realistic for me than impressing billionaires." Sebastian's eyes lingered on her face a second longer than necessary. Something about the honesty in her answer seemed to affect him unexpectedly. Finally, he turned toward the glass desk and pressed a button on the intercom. "Send Eleanor upstairs." Claire frowned slightly. "Who is Eleanor?" Sebastian adjusted his cuff calmly. "The woman who dresses senators, royalty, and occasionally difficult billionaires." Claire's eyes widened instantly. "No, absolutely not. I cannot afford that." Sebastian looked back at her evenly. "I did not ask what you could afford." A quiet knock interrupted them moments later as a silver-haired woman in all black entered carrying fabric samples and measuring tape around her neck. Eleanor stopped immediately the second she saw Claire. Then she smiled slowly. "Oh," she said softly. "Now I understand." Claire looked between them in confusion while Sebastian reached for his coat near the chair. You have 6 hours before the gala begins, he said calmly. Try not to start another international incident before then, Miss Bennet. And for the first time since Claire had met him, she could have sworn Sebastian Hale was hiding a smile. Claire had never seen a dressmaker cry over fabric before. Yet Eleanor Whitmore stood completely still in the center of the Hale and row-fitting suite, holding a length of midnight blue silk against Claire's shoulders with suspiciously glassy eyes. Do you know what most wealthy women ask me when they walk into this room? Eleanor asked quietly while circling Claire with measuring tape draped around her neck. Claire shook her head. They ask how to be noticed, Eleanor said softly. You walked in trying to disappear. The private styling suite overlooked Manhattan through towering windows streaked with soft winter snow. Racks of couture gowns lined the walls beneath warm golden lights, while assistants moved silently between mirrors, carrying shoes, jewelry, and steaming cups of tea. Claire felt painfully out of place among all of it. She stood on a small fitting platform, wearing stocking feet, while Eleanor pinned fabric carefully along the waist of the navy dress. Too much embellishment would ruin this, Eleanor murmured to herself. She already has presence. Claire blinked. Ido. Eleanor gave her a look through the mirror. Child, wealthy women spend $50,000 trying to buy what you naturally have. Claire almost laughed at that. Almost. But before she could answer, one of the assistants entered holding a velvet box. Inside rested a diamond necklace that looked expensive enough to purchase an entire apartment building. Claire immediately stepped backward. No, Eleanor raised one eyebrow. No, I cannot wear that. Why not? Claire stared at the diamonds sparkling beneath the lights. Because if something happens to it, I would have to sell my organs to repay you people. The assistant choked, trying not to laugh. Even Eleanor smiled faintly. Good, she said softly. You still have common sense. That already makes you more qualified for tonight than half the guest list. 2 hours passed in a blur of steaming fabric, hairstyling, and quiet instructions about royal etiquette Claire already secretly knew. Eleanor noticed quickly. Interesting, she murmured while adjusting the sleeve of Claire's gown. Most girls need coaching by now. You already know how to greet diplomats. Claire hesitated before answering. My grandmother taught me. Your grandmother sounds extraordinary. Claire looked down briefly. She cleaned houses for wealthy families in Connecticut. Eleanor stopped moving entirely. Then she smiled softly toward Claire's reflection in the mirror. Ah, she whispered. That explains it. Outside the suite, Sebastian Hale stood alone near the hallway windows, pretending to review event schedules on his phone while actually listening to fragments of conversation through the partially open door. He had spent the entire afternoon trying unsuccessfully to focus on work. Investor calls, royal security coordination, press management. None of it held his attention longer than 30 seconds. Every time he tried concentrating, he remembered Claire Bennet kneeling beside that frightened waitress after the champagne accident, while everyone else watched the spectacle. No cameras had been pointed at her then. No executives paying attention. She had helped because kindness was instinctive to her. Sebastian found that strangely dangerous. You are staring again. Sebastian glanced sideways as his younger sister Olivia approached carrying coffee cups. Olivia Hale was one of the few people alive completely unimpressed by billionaire status. At 34, she ran the Hale Foundation and possessed the unsettling ability to read her brother almost instantly. I am reviewing preparations, Sebastian replied smoothly. Olivia handed him a coffee. You had security replay footage of one employee 6 times last night. Sebastian remained silent. Olivia smirked slightly. That bad, huh? He exhaled slowly and looked back toward the fitting suite doors. Everyone in that ballroom saw a poor assistant who embarrassed herself. And you saw? Olivia asked carefully. Sebastian's jaw tightened slightly. Someone trying harder than anyone else in the room. Olivia studied him for a long moment before smiling knowingly. Careful, Sebastian. Men like you usually mistake admiration for control. Before he could answer, the fitting room doors opened softly. Conversation stopped almost instantly throughout the hallway. Claire stepped out slowly beside Eleanor wearing the completed gown. Midnight blue silk flowed elegantly against her figure without looking flashy or forced. The sapphire hairpin rested carefully against soft waves of blonde hair gathered loosely near one shoulder. Minimal jewelry. No dramatic mock-up. Nothing excessive. She looked timeless. Sebastian forgot to breathe for half a second. Not because she looked beautiful. Although she did. It was something else entirely. Claire looked calm, like she had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Employees nearby stared openly. One stylist whispered, "That cannot be the same girl." Claire noticed Sebastian immediately standing near the windows in his black tuxedo. The city lights behind him made the entire moment feel unreal somehow. Her pulse stumbled awkwardly. Sebastian crossed the hallway toward her slowly, eyes never leaving her face. "Well?" Eleanor asked him expectantly. Sebastian remained silent a moment too long. Then finally, very quietly, he said, "You were right." Claire frowned slightly. "About what?" His gaze shifted briefly toward the sapphire hairpin resting in her hair. "You do belong in rooms like tonight." Something fragile moved unexpectedly through Claire's chest at the words. Nobody had ever said that to her before. Not teachers, not employers, not even herself. For a second, the entire noisy hallway faded away. Then Vivian Laurent appeared at the far end of the corridor, wearing a silver couture gown, with photographers already surrounding her. The second she saw Claire standing beside Sebastian, her expression darkened almost imperceptibly. And across the hallway, Olivia Hale quietly watched Vivian's reaction before murmuring under her breath, "Oh no, this just became a war." Snow drifted softly across Manhattan as black luxury vehicles lined the entrance of the Astoria Crown Hotel beneath glowing gold lights and towering evergreen arrangements wrapped in crystal ribbons. Reporters crowded behind velvet barriers while camera flashes burst non-stop against the winter night. Diplomats, socialites, tech billionaires, old European families whose names lived inside museums and universities. Everyone important in New York seemed to arrive at once. Claire Bennett sat frozen inside the back seat of a black town car, 3 blocks away, gripping her small evening clutch tightly enough to hurt her fingers. Her heartbeat filled the silence louder than the city outside. "Breathe," Eleanor Whitmore said calmly beside her. Claire stared through the tinted window toward the hotel entrance, glowing in the distance like another universe entirely. "I cannot do this." "Of course you can." "No, Clyde Guisperdanistli." I memorized etiquette books in a 600-square-foot apartment while eating canned soup. That is not the same thing as belonging here. Eleanor studied her quietly before adjusting the sapphire hairpin slightly against Claire's blonde curls. "Listen to me carefully," she said softly. "Every woman walking into that ballroom tonight is afraid of something. The difference is wealthy people hide fear behind diamonds." Claire swallowed hard. Outside, another burst of camera flashes illuminated the snowy sidewalk. "What if they laugh at me?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then let them embarrass themselves." Before Claire could answer, the car door opened. Cold winter air swept inside, instantly carrying the distant sound of reporters shouting names into microphones. Sebastian Hale stood outside the car in a black tuxedo beneath falling snow, one gloved hand extended toward her calmly. For half a second, Claire simply stared at him. He looked less like a businessman tonight and more like the kind of man newspapers built legend around. Tall, controlled, impossibly composed beneath the chaos of flashing cameras and screaming reporters outside. "You are late," he said quietly. Claire blinked. I almost turned around. That would have disappointed half of Manhattan. His voice remained dry and unreadable, but something warm flickered briefly behind his gray eyes. Claire hesitated only 1 second longer before placing her hand carefully into his. The moment she stepped onto the sidewalk, camera flashes exploded across the entrance. Reporters immediately surged forward, shouting questions. "Mr. Hale, who is she? Is this your date tonight?" "Miss, over here, please." Claire instinctively stiffened beside him. Sebastian noticed instantly. Without looking directly at her, he leaned slightly closer and murmured under the noise, "Do not look at the cameras." "Where do I look?" she whispered nervously. "Straight ahead." His hand settled lightly against the middle of her back, guiding her toward the entrance. Calm, steady, protective. The contact nearly unraveled her concentration completely. Inside the Astoria Crown ballroom, everything glittered. Massive crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while a live orchestra played soft classical music beneath towering gold arches covered in winter roses. Waiters in white gloves moved elegantly through the crowd, balancing silver trays filled with champagne. Conversations floated through the room in polished accents from London, Paris, and Manhattan penthouses. Claire felt every pair of eyes turn toward her the moment she entered beside Sebastian. And then something unexpected happened. Nobody laughed. They stared. A duchess near the staircase visibly paused mid-conversation. Several reporters inside the ballroom immediately lifted cameras again. Men in tailored tuxedos looked openly intrigued, while women studied Claire with narrowed curiosity. Not because she looked flashy. Quite the opposite. The midnight blue gown moved like liquid against the warm ballroom lights, while the sapphire hairpin added just enough old-world elegance to feel intentional instead of excessive. Claire looked refined in a way expensive people rarely achieved naturally anymore. Sebastian noticed a shift in the room immediately. So did Vivienne Laurent, standing near the royal reception line in silver couture. Her expression tightened the instant Sebastian entered beside Claire. "Interesting," Olivia Hale murmured nearby while sipping champagne. The wolves looked nervous. Claire tried focusing on breathing normally while Sebastian guided her through the ballroom. "Everyone is staring," she whispered quietly through a strained smile. "That is because nobody recognizes you," he replied smoothly. "Mystery makes wealthy people uncomfortable." Claire almost laughed despite herself. Then suddenly, an elderly British diplomat approached them near the orchestra stage. "Sebastian," the man greeted warmly before turning toward Claire. "And who might this remarkable young woman be?" Claire's pulse stumbled again. Sebastian glanced toward her, calm, expectant, giving her the choice to speak for herself. Claire straightened slightly before offering a graceful nod, exactly the way her grandmother taught her years ago. "Claire Bennett," she said softly. "It is an honor to meet you, Ambassador Whitmore." Surprise flashed across the older man's face instantly. "You know protocol." "A little. Most Americans do not." Claire smiled politely. "Most Americans are not invited to royal galas." The ambassador laughed warmly. Genuine laughter, not mocking. Nearby guests immediately took notice. Sebastian watched Claire carefully while conversation after conversation began forming around her naturally. She spoke calmly with diplomats, discussed Renaissance art with a museum chairman, thanked every server who offered champagne by name after reading their badges. Nothing about her looked forced. She was not pretending to belong anymore. Somehow she simply did. And standing several feet away, beneath crystal chandeliers and camera flashes, Sebastian Hale felt something unfamiliar settle heavily in his chest for the first time in years. Pretty dangerous, undeniable pride. But across the ballroom, Vivienne Laurent watched the entire scene unfold with cold fury building behind her eyes. Because for the first time all evening, nobody was looking at her anymore. The orchestra shifted into a softer melody as dinner service began beneath the enormous crystal chandeliers, and by then Claire Bennett had unknowingly become the center of the entire ballroom. Conversations kept circling back toward her no matter where she moved. Wealthy investors asked for introductions. Diplomats smiled warmly when she spoke. Even the royal staff seemed more relaxed around her than around most of the elite guests who spent the evening competing for attention. Claire still could not understand it. She had spent years feeling invisible in rooms far less intimidating than this one. Yet tonight, every instinct her grandmother taught her seemed to return naturally, like some forgotten version of herself had quietly awakened beneath the ballroom lights. "You are handling this disturbingly well," Olivia Hale whispered while joining her near one of the marble columns. Claire accepted a sparkling water from a passing server before answering carefully. I'm trying very hard not to faint. Olivia laughed softly. That already makes you more authentic than 90% of this room. Across the ballroom, Sebastian stood speaking with Prince Alexander's advisors near the stage, but his attention drifted repeatedly back toward Claire without meaning to. He noticed everything. The way she thanked every waiter directly. The way nervous junior employees visibly relaxed around her. The way she listened fully when people spoke instead of scanning the room for someone wealthier. None of it looked strategic. That was the problem. Nothing about Claire Bennett felt calculated, and Sebastian lived in a world built entirely on calculation. Your mysterious guest is causing problems, one investor murmured beside him with an amused smile. Sebastian barely glanced over. How unfortunate. Half the board is trying to figure out where she came from. Sebastian's eyes found Claire again across the ballroom. So am I. Before the investor could respond, sudden tension rippled near the center reception line. A middle-aged European countess stood visibly uncomfortable while several aggressive reporters pressed closer with microphones and cameras. Countess Duval, one reporter called loudly, "Is it true your family is withdrawing support from the Restoration Fund?" Another interrupted before she could answer. "Will the palace release a statement tonight?" The older woman looked overwhelmed immediately. Her English seemed limited, and several guests nearby pretended not to notice the growing discomfort. Claire watched the scene unfold from across the ballroom, while the Countess gripped her champagne glass tighter with every question. Instinct moved before thought did. Claire crossed the marble floor calmly and stepped gently between the reporters and the visibly distressed woman. "Excuse me," Claire said politely but firmly. The reporters paused in surprise. Claire offered the Countess a warm, reassuring smile before speaking in soft French. "Would you like me to help you back toward the reception lounge?" Relief flooded the older woman's face instantly. "Please." The nearby reporters looked stunned. Claire turned back toward them with perfect composure. "The Countess has already agreed to discuss the foundation tomorrow morning through official channels," she said smoothly. "Tonight is a charity event honoring pediatric cardiac research. I'm sure none of you want headlines suggesting you cornered a 70-year-old guest during a medical fundraiser." Silence followed instantly. One reporter actually lowered his microphone, looking embarrassed. Another muttered an apology under his breath. Claire simply smiled politely before escorting the Countess away toward the quieter lounge area beside the orchestra. Across the ballroom, Sebastian stared at her in complete disbelief. "She speaks French?" one executive asked beside him. Olivia folded her arms with visible satisfaction. "Apparently better than your communications department." Prince Alexander himself had witnessed the interaction from nearby. The young royal leaned slightly toward Sebastian with obvious curiosity. "Your companion handled that elegantly," he remarked. Sebastian remained silent for a second too long before answering quietly. "She's not really my companion." The prince glanced back toward Claire thoughtfully. "That may be unfortunate." Meanwhile, inside the quieter lounge alcove, Countess Duval squeezed Claire's hand warmly once they sat down. "You saved me," she said gratefully. Claire smiled gently. "You looked uncomfortable." "Most people here only notice titles," the Countess replied softly. "You noticed fear." The words settled heavily in Claire's chest. Before she could answer, a familiar deep voice spoke nearby. "There you are." Claire turned and found Sebastian standing at the lounge entrance, watching her with unreadable intensity again. The Countess smiled knowingly between them before excusing herself discreetly. Suddenly the quiet lounge felt much smaller. Claire stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of her gown nervously. "I hope I did not overstep." Sebastian stared at her for several long seconds before answering. "You embarrassed 3 reporters, impressed a prince, and rescued a diplomatic situation my public relations team failed to handle." Claire blinked once. "Is that bad?" To her surprise, Sebastian laughed quietly under his breath. A real laugh this time. Low, warm, Dangerous. Claire felt the sound somewhere directly beneath her ribs. You really have no idea what you're doing to this room tonight, do you? He asked softly. Claire looked away briefly toward the ballroom lights reflecting across the marble floors. Honestly, she admitted, I've spent most of my life trying not to be noticed. Sebastian stepped slightly closer. Not enough to touch her, just enough for his voice to lower. That may no longer be possible. For one suspended moment, neither of them looked away. The orchestra music softened in the distance, while snow drifted slowly beyond the enormous ballroom windows overlooking Manhattan. Claire suddenly became aware of every tiny detail at once. The scent of cedar and expensive cologne lingering near him. The warmth in his gray eyes she had never seen before. The terrifying realization that Sebastian Hale was no longer looking at her like an experiment. He was looking at her like a man slowly losing control of his own assumptions. But neither of them noticed Vivian Laurent standing across the ballroom near the press balcony with a cold expression and a phone clutched tightly in her hand while private investigators' files opened across the screen. Because Vivian had finally decided if Claire Bennett could not be outshined tonight, then she would be exposed instead. The first sign that something was wrong came when the music stopped. Not completely, just abruptly enough for conversations across the ballroom to falter beneath the chandeliers. Claire looked up instinctively from beside the lounge balcony, where she had been quietly speaking with Sebastian about nothing and everything at once. Snow drifted softly beyond the massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan, while warm candlelight flickered against marble walls. For the first time all evening, Claire had almost forgotten she was afraid. Then the ballroom screens lit up. Every conversation died instantly. At first, Claire thought it was part of the Gala presentation schedule. A charity video, perhaps. But instead of fundraising graphics, an image appeared across every enormous screen inside the ballroom. Her apartment building, grainy photographs, old subway security stills, a scanned hospital debt notice with her mother's name partially visible. Claire's blood turned cold so quickly it physically hurt. Around the room, whispers spread immediately. Who is that? Wait, that is her. She lives in Queens? Another image flashed onto the screens. Claire in a grocery store uniform from years earlier. Then another. Claire carrying cleaning supplies into a service elevator at Hale and Row headquarters. Beneath the photos, massive white lettering appeared across the black screens. The Royal Gala's mystery woman. Just a janitor's daughter? Silence collapsed over the ballroom. Absolute silence. Claire stopped breathing. Across the room, Vivian Laurent stood near the press balcony, holding a champagne glass with slow, calculated calm, while reporters immediately lifted phones and cameras toward the screens. "Oh my God," Olivia Hale whispered nearby. Sebastian's expression darkened instantly. Dangerous. Controlled. But dangerous. "Turn it off," he said coldly to the event staff. Nobody moved fast enough. Another image appeared. Claire sitting beside her mother outside a public hospital months earlier wearing worn jeans and exhausted eyes. Then came the final headline. From poverty to palace ballroom. Who let her in? Laughter did not erupt. That was somehow worse. Instead, the ballroom filled with soft whispers and careful stares. The kind wealthy people used when pretending cruelty was sophistication. Claire could physically feel hundreds of eyes pressing against her skin. Shame flooded her so violently she thought she might collapse. Suddenly, every expensive light in the ballroom felt too bright. Every crystal reflection too sharp. Sebastian stepped toward her immediately. Claire, but she could not look at him. Not after this. Not while every humiliating piece of her life hung 20 feet tall above the room like entertainment. "I should leave," she whispered faintly. "Claire, listen to me. You knew this would happen, did you not?" Her voice trembled despite her effort to control it. Sebastian froze. "What?" Claire finally looked up at him then, blue eyes shining with hurt more than anger. "This whole night," she whispered. "The invitation, the cameras, the mysterious poor girl in a ballroom full of billionaires. Was this another experiment?" No, his answer came instantly. Fierce, honest. But before he could say more, a reporter shoved closer, holding up a microphone. Miss Bennett, is it true your mother worked as a cleaning employee? Another voice followed immediately. Did Mr. Hale know about your background before bringing you tonight? Claire, over here, please. Flashbulbs exploded across the ballroom again. Claire stepped backward instinctively, overwhelmed by the noise, the lights, the humiliation wrapping around her chest tighter every second. Then something happened that nobody expected. One of the young waitresses carrying champagne trays near the ballroom stairs suddenly stumbled hard after colliding with a distracted guest. Crystal glasses shattered across the marble floor. The girl froze in horror while red wine splashed down the front of her white uniform. Instantly, several guests recoiled in annoyance. Watch where you're going. Unbelievable. These service people are getting worse every year. The waitress looked barely 20 years old. Terrified, humiliated, seconds from tears. And despite everything happening around her, despite the cameras still pointed toward her own ruined dignity, Claire moved without hesitation. She crossed the ballroom immediately and knelt beside the shaking waitress on the marble floor. Hey, Claire said gently. Look at me. It is okay. The girl tried apologizing through panicked breaths. Claire took the napkins from the tray calmly and helped clean the spilled glasses before the girl could cut herself. Nobody is hurt, Claire whispered softly. Breathe first, panic later. The entire ballroom watched in silence. No performance. No cameras ignadith. Claire simply helped because someone else was hurting. Sebastian stood motionless several feet away watching the scene unfold while realization hit him all at once with brutal clarity. Vivian had tried exposing Claire's poverty as if it were shameful. But all she had really exposed was the difference between Claire and everyone else in that room. Because even while publicly humiliated beneath royal chandeliers and billionaire judgment, Claire Bennett still noticed the frightened waitress before she noticed herself. A soft murmur spread slowly across the ballroom now, but the energy had changed completely. People were no longer staring at Claire with mockery. They were staring with discomfort, because suddenly the cruel screens above them felt ugly. Small, petty. Prince Alexander himself stepped forward beside Sebastian quietly. That young woman, he said softly while watching Claire comfort the waitress, has more dignity than this entire ballroom combined. Sebastian's jaw tightened as he looked toward Vivian across the room. She realized too late the mood was shifting against her, because for the first time all night, nobody was looking at Claire's past anymore. They were looking at her character instead. And Sebastian Hale finally understood he was about to destroy anyone who tried, making her feel small again. The ballroom remained silent long after the shattered champagne glasses had been cleared away. Not the comfortable silence of elegance or ceremony. This silence felt heavier, uneasy, because the room had just witnessed something none of them expected. Claire Bennett had been publicly humiliated beneath crystal chandeliers and international press cameras. Yet the only person she noticed was a frightened waitress trying not to cry on a marble floor. Wealthy guests shifted awkwardly now beneath the glow of gold candlelight. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others glanced up at the giant screens, still displaying pieces of Claire's past like evidence of some terrible crime. Hospital debt notices. Grocery store uniforms. Tiny apartments. Suddenly the images did not look scandalous anymore. They looked human. Claire slowly stood from beside the young waitress after making sure the girl was steady again. Her midnight blue gown brushed softly against the marble while broken crystal fragments reflected around her feet like scattered ice. Thank you, the waitress whispered shakily. Claire offered her a small, reassuring smile. You are doing fine. Then she turned slightly and froze when she realized the entire ballroom was watching her differently now. Not with ridicule, with shame. Across the room, Vivian Lawrence's composure cracked for the first time all evening. This is ridiculous, she snapped sharply toward one of the event coordinators nearby. Remove those screens already. But before anyone could react, Sebastian Hale stepped forward. Calm, controlled, terrifyingly composed. The ballroom instinctively parted around him. His expression revealed nothing, which somehow made him more dangerous than if he had shouted. He walked directly toward the center stage beneath the enormous crystal chandelier, while every reporter immediately redirected cameras toward him. Olivia Hale watched from the side of the ballroom and quietly murmured, "Oh no," because she knew that look on her brother's face. Sebastian reached the stage slowly before turning toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly. His voice carried effortlessly across the silent ballroom. Tonight was intended to honor generosity, dignity, and humanitarian work. Nobody moved. Nobody even lifted a champagne glass. Sebastian's gaze swept calmly across the giant screens, still displaying Claire's past. Then toward Vivian, standing rigid near the press balcony. Instead, he continued quietly, "Some people decided poverty should be treated as entertainment." The tension inside the room tightened instantly. Vivian folded her arms defensively. "Sebastian, no," he interrupted calmly without even raising his voice. "You wanted everyone here to see who Claire Bennett really is." He turned then, slowly, deliberately. His eyes found Claire, standing near the ballroom stairs, still stunned by everything unfolding around her. "So let us discuss who she really is." The entire room remained motionless. Sebastian looked back toward the guests. Tonight, while most of this ballroom stood watching someone vulnerable become humiliated, Claire Bennett crossed the room to help another person without hesitation. His voice sharpened slightly now. "No cameras requested. No advantage gained. No audience needed." Reporters scribbled notes furiously. Camera flashes erupted again. But now every lens pointed at Claire with fascination instead of mockery. Sebastian continued calmly. "Several months ago, one of our junior employees was falsely accused of stealing from a Hale and Roe event account. Most executives recommended termination." He paused briefly. Claire Bennett stayed 3 extra unpaid hours after work to help that employee prove her innocence. Soft murmurs spread through the ballroom again. Olivia smiled faintly because even she had not known that story. Sebastian's eyes never left the crowd. She did not tell anyone afterward. She did not ask for recognition. She simply helped because she saw another human being struggling. Then finally, his voice lowered into something colder, more personal. "And tonight, some of you decided the shameful part of her story was that she grew up poor." The words landed like glass breaking. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Sebastian glanced toward the giant screens one final time before addressing the ballroom with brutal clarity. "The problem with people who inherit privilege is that eventually they begin mistaking wealth for character." Vivian's face paled instantly. Prince Alexander lowered his champagne glass slowly while several diplomats nearby exchanged quiet, approving looks. Sebastian descended from the stage, then, and crossed the ballroom directly toward Claire. Every camera followed him. Every guest watched breathlessly. Claire's pulse hammered violently as he stopped in front of her beneath the chandeliers. For one suspended second, neither of them spoke. Then Sebastian reached up carefully toward the sapphire hairpin resting in her hair. His fingers brushed the edge gently. "You asked me earlier if tonight was some kind of experiment," he said softly enough that only she could hear. Claire swallowed hard. "Was it?" Sebastian's expression shifted finally. Not cold anymore. Honest. No, his voice roughened slightly. "But I think this room just exposed itself instead." Emotion tightened painfully in Claire's chest. Around them, reporters continued snapping photographs nonstop, while social media feeds exploded in real time across phones throughout the ballroom. Headlines were already changing. Mystery Gala woman defended by billionaire CEO. Royal guest praise employees class under pressure. Unknown assistant outshines elite at Winter Gala. Vivian looked around slowly and realized with horror that she had lost complete control of the narrative. Nobody cared about Claire's apartment anymore. Nobody cared about grocery store uniforms or hospital bills, because Claire Bennett had just done the one thing high society could never imitate convincingly. She had remained kind after being humiliated, and standing beneath thousands of crystal lights while cameras captured every second, Sebastian Hale finally stopped fighting the truth that had been building inside him since the night of the champagne accident. He was no longer protecting Claire Bennett because she deserved fairness. He was protecting her because somewhere along the way, without permission or warning, she had become the most important person in the room to him. 3 weeks after the Royal Winter Gala, Manhattan still could not stop talking about Claire Bennett. Her face appeared everywhere. News articles, fashion blogs, charity interviews, viral clips across social media showing the moment she knelt beside the frightened waitress while luxury guests stood frozen nearby. The headlines had evolved far beyond scandal now. The woman who outclassed high society. Billionaire CEO defends employee after Gala controversy. Kindness becomes the real headline at royal fundraiser. Claire barely recognized her own life anymore. One moment, she had been a nearly invisible logistics assistant riding crowded subway trains to work in worn black flats. The next, strangers smiled at her on sidewalks while reporters waited outside Hale and Row headquarters hoping for photographs. But the strangest change of all was Sebastian Hale. He no longer looked at her with curiosity. He looked at her with certainty, and that terrified Claire far more than cameras ever could. "You are thinking too loudly again," her mother said softly one snowy evening while Claire stood near the apartment window, staring down at Queens traffic glowing beneath Christmas lights. Claire turned slightly. "Is that even possible? For you?" "Yes." Her mother smiled faintly beneath the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Recovery had been improving slowly these past weeks after the Hale Foundation quietly arranged access to a top cardiac specialist. Claire still did not know Sebastian had personally made the call himself at 2 in the morning after learning about her mother's condition. "You like him," her mother said gently. Claire looked away immediately. "That is not simple. Nothing worthwhile ever is." Claire laughed quietly under her breath before walking toward the kitchen. "He belongs in penthouses and boardrooms and magazines." "And where do you belong?" her mother asked. Claire stopped moving. That question lingered with her the entire night, because for the first time in years, she genuinely did not know the answer anymore. The following Friday evening, a black car arrived outside her apartment building just after sunset. Claire stepped carefully onto the snowy sidewalk wearing a long wool coat and the sapphire hairpin tucked softly into loose blonde curls again. Sebastian stood beside the open car door waiting for her in a charcoal overcoat with snow collecting lightly across his dark hair. "You never tell me where we are going," Claire said while climbing inside beside him. "That is because you would overthink it. I already overthink everything." "I noticed." The corner of his mouth curved slightly. Claire still had not fully adjusted to seeing him smile. It transformed him completely. Less untouchable billionaire. More human. The car drove through Manhattan, glowing with Christmas lights and crowded holiday storefronts, before finally stopping outside the Astoria Crown Hotel again. Claire frowned instantly. "Sebastian, trust me, that sentence has historically caused problems." He actually laughed softly at that. Minutes later, they entered the ballroom together. But this time everything was different. No reporters, no orchestra, no diplomats or billionaires. The massive ballroom stood completely empty beneath thousands of glowing crystal lights reflecting softly across polished marble floors. Only one thing waited in the center of the room. A small private dinner table surrounded by white roses and candlelight. Claire stopped walking entirely. "What is this?" Sebastian looked almost uncomfortable for the first time since she met him. "An apology?" Claire blinked slowly. "For what?" He exhaled quietly and looked around the ballroom. "For inviting you here the first time because I thought it would teach you a lesson." Claire stared at him silently. Sebastian continued carefully. "I spent most of my life believing powerful rooms mattered because powerful people filled them." His gray eyes found hers again. "Honest now. Unprotected. Then you walked into this ballroom and made every person here look smaller simply by being kind." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in Claire's chest. Sebastian stepped closer slowly beneath the chandelier light. "You changed something in me, Claire." The softness in his voice nearly undid her completely. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Snow drifted quietly outside the enormous windows while candlelight flickered across the marble floor around them. Finally, Claire whispered the question she had been carrying for weeks. Why me? Sebastian smiled faintly then. Not arrogant, not polished, real. Because you're the first person I have ever met who never treated human dignity like it depended on money. Claire looked down briefly, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. Then Sebastian reached carefully into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box. Claire's breath caught instantly. Sebastian, relax, he said softly. It is not what you think. He opened the box slowly. Inside rested the sapphire hairpin, restored completely. The deep blue stone shimmered beneath the chandelier light more beautifully than ever before. Claire stared at it speechless. How did you? Your mother told me your grandmother bought it from a pawn shop in Connecticut 30 years ago. His voice lowered slightly. I thought it deserved to survive another generation. Claire felt tears burn suddenly behind her eyes. Sebastian lifted the hairpin gently before stepping behind her and securing it carefully into her hair. His fingers brushed softly against her skin for only a second, but warmth rushed through Claire instantly anyway. When she turned back toward him,